What if the cruelest part of Ronaldo's story is not that injuries slowed him down, but that they may have stolen one of the greatest careers football was ever supposed to see? Not just a few extra goals, not just a few more trophies, an entire football destiny. Because when people talk about Ronaldo Nazario, they usually talk about what he did: the speed, the power, the balance, the goals, the fear. But maybe the real tragedy begins when we stop looking at what he became and start asking what he was still on the way to becoming. Because before the knees gave way, Ronaldo did not look like a player merely heading toward greatness. He looked like a player who was about to redefine the ceiling for what a center forward could be. That is what makes this story so painful. We are not talking about a star who got injured after his best years were already behind him. We are talking about a phenomenon whose peak arrived absurdly early, whose prime was exploding in front of the entire world, and whose body then interrupted a career that still felt unfinished even after he had already become immortal. And that raises the question that still haunts football. What exactly was taken from him? What career did injuries steal from Ronaldo? And just how great could he really have become? To answer that, we first have to understand something important. Ronaldo was not simply a brilliant young striker who happened to score a lot of goals. Football has seen those before. What made him different was that he looked physically and technically impossible at the same time. Usually, a player that explosive is not that composed. A player that powerful is not that fluid. A player that fast is not that precise in tight spaces. But Ronaldo combined all of it inside one terrifying body. He could destroy defenders in open grass, humiliate them in crowded areas, survive heavy contact, and still finish with the calm of a player who never felt rushed by the moment. At PSV, Europe already saw enough to understand that this was not normal. At Barcelona, the game seemed to bend around him, and by the time he went to Inter, he was not just a future Ballon d'Or winner, he was already a football event. Every match carried that same tension. If Ronaldo received the ball and found even half a yard, the whole defensive structure started to panic. That matters, because when we ask how great he could have become, we are not projecting fantasy onto a talented kid who never proved himself. We are looking at a player who had already proven almost everything, and still seemed to be accelerating toward an even higher level. If you enjoy football stories that go beyond numbers and into mythology, stay with the channel, because this is one of the saddest and most fascinating what-ifs the sport has ever produced. Not because Ronaldo failed. He did not fail. He conquered football anyway. The tragedy is that even his legendary career may only represent a reduced version of his true destiny. Before the major knee injuries, Ronaldo's trajectory felt almost unnatural. He was winning individual awards young. He was dominating elite defenders young. He was carrying the aura of the best striker in the world while still looking like someone who had not fully finished evolving. That is the key point. Most great players eventually arrive at a stable final version of themselves. With Ronaldo, it felt like the final version never fully arrived. We saw devastating stages of his development, but maybe not the completed masterpiece. And the timing of the injuries is what makes the loss so enormous. They did not arrive after a slow decline. They struck when his game was built on violent acceleration, brutal changes of direction, and the kind of explosive force that made defenders look physically outmatched. That was not just style. That was the engine of his dominance. When a player like that suffers catastrophic damage in the knees, he does not simply lose 10% of himself. He can lose the very weapon that made him historically unique. That is why it is not enough to say Ronaldo would have had a few more good seasons without injuries. That idea may actually be too small. The more uncomfortable possibility is that football lost the absolute peak of his peak. The version of Ronaldo that would have combined the raw destruction of his early years with the maturity, reading of space, and finishing intelligence that usually come later. Imagine the unstoppable runner from Barcelona and early Inter, but with even greater tactical control, even sharper decision-making, and the experience to manipulate entire defensive lines before touching the ball. That is the career people feel was stolen. Because think about what happened after the injuries. He still came back. He still won the World Cup in 2002. He still scored on the biggest stage. He still played for Real Madrid and remained one of the most feared names in football. But he returned as a different creature, still elite, still lethal, still historically great, yet not quite the same hurricane. The long, surging runs became rarer. The repeated explosions over distance became less frequent. The body that once looked unfair now had to negotiate with pain, weight, recovery, and physical limitation. And that is where the story becomes almost unbearable from a football perspective. If the diminished version of Ronaldo was still good enough to become world champion, still good enough to dominate major moments, still good enough to leave behind one of the greatest striker legacies ever, then what would the undiminished version have done? How many more years would he have ruled? How many more defenders would he have broken psychologically? How many more seasons would have belonged completely to him? This is where people naturally move toward numbers. More Ballon d'Or, more league titles, more Champions League campaigns, more goals. And yes, all of that is possible. But the deepest loss is not statistical first. It is experiential. Football lost the privilege of watching the full evolution of a player who seemed built to terrify the sport at its highest level. We lost the chance to see whether his prime could have stretched across an era instead of flashing through it like a violent comet. And the timing of the football landscape makes the question even bigger. The late 90s and early 2000s were full of elite defending, tactical discipline, and brutal physical contests. This was not a soft environment where stars were protected from contact. This was a world of cynical fouls, hard challenges, compact defensive blocks, and some of the smartest defenders ever to play the game. That is exactly why Ronaldo's rise felt so extraordinary. He was not doing this against weak resistance. He was doing it against monsters. Which means his unfinished career cannot be judged like a romantic fantasy. It has to be judged against evidence we already saw. The evidence says this: he was already bending elite football to his will before his body betrayed him. So when people say injuries stole a career from Ronaldo, they do not mean that he would have merely aged gracefully into a slightly bigger legend. They mean he may have had a real path to becoming one of the uncontested giants of the entire sport. Not just the most terrifying striker peak, not just the greatest what if, but one of those names that sits at the center of every serious, greatest ever conversation without qualification. That is why the debate around Ronaldo always feels different from other injury stories. With many players, we wonder whether they could have become great. With Ronaldo, greatness is already established. The question is whether injuries prevented him from becoming something even rarer than greatness, something almost unreachable, a career so complete that the debates would become much shorter and much more uncomfortable for everyone else. Imagine a Ronaldo whose body survives the turn of the century intact. Imagine that same acceleration still there, that same terrifying first step, that same ability to absorb contact and keep balance, but now paired with a player entering his true tactical maturity. Imagine several more years of him arriving to major tournaments and league seasons, not as a survivor or a comeback story, but as the fully armed version of the most frightening striker on earth. That is where the imagination starts to run wild. Because maybe we are not talking about a player who would have added details to his legacy. Maybe we are talking about a player who would have changed the entire historical hierarchy of football. And yet, maybe the saddest part is that Ronaldo himself gave us enough after the injuries to make the loss feel even more real. If he had vanished completely, the myth would be different. People would speculate, but from a distance. Instead, he returned and showed us that even after devastation, even after surgeries, even after the body had clearly changed, genius still remained. He still scored. He still sensed danger before everyone else. He still moved like a predator inside decisive moments. He still found a way to stand on top of the world in 2002. That comeback does not reduce the tragedy, it sharpens it. Because it proves the football intelligence and finishing genius were never the issue. The issue was what those gifts could have looked like inside an unbroken body. There is also something important about legacy here. Modern football often rewards longevity in our memory. We count decades. We count accumulated records. We count sustained dominance. Ronaldo's case is so powerful because he forces us to confront another form of greatness, the greatness of intensity. The greatness of a peak so violent, so dazzling, and so obviously unnatural that it leaves a permanent scar on the imagination, even without perfect durability. But again, that is also why the question hurts. If he already left that kind of scar with an interrupted body, then a full, healthy career might have left something even bigger than mythology. It might have left consensus. And consensus is exactly what injuries may have taken away. Without those breakdowns, maybe the conversation is no longer only about Maradona's genius, Pelé's total legacy, Messi's longevity, or Cristiano's numbers. Maybe Ronaldo forces his way into that room with a case too overwhelming to ignore. Maybe the phrase, best natural center forward ever, becomes too small for him. Maybe he becomes one of the reference points for football perfection itself. Of course, we can never prove any of this completely. Football does not replay history with healthier knees. There is no alternate archive waiting for us. That is what gives the story its permanent ache. Every argument remains unfinished, just like the career itself. But unfinished does not mean baseless. We saw enough to know the question is real. We saw enough to know the loss was not imaginary. We saw enough to believe that one of football's biggest thefts did not happen in a transfer market or a boardroom. It happened inside a body that could no longer carry the force of the player living in it. So what career did injuries steal from Ronaldo? Maybe they stole multiple Ballons d'Or. Maybe they stole years of domestic dominance. Maybe they stole Champions League nights that would have become part of football folklore. Maybe they stole the complete statistical mountain that modern debates worship so much. But deeper than all of that, they may have stolen the most complete version of Ronaldo himself. The version where youth, violence, technique, intelligence, and ruthless finishing all meet at once for longer than football was allowed to witness. And how great could he have become? Great enough that the argument still refuses to die decades later. Great enough that players with longer careers do not erase him from the conversation. Great enough that defenders, fans, and former teammates still talk about him with a kind of awe that sounds different from ordinary praise. Great enough that even now, when we try to imagine the most frightening striker possible, our imagination keeps rebuilding him. That is the cruel immortality of Ronaldo Nazario. Injuries may have stolen part of his career, but they could not erase the evidence of what he was. They could not erase the terror of his first step. They could not erase the balance, the violence, the ease, the humiliation he brought to world-class defenders. And maybe that is why his story remains so powerful. He does not only represent greatness achieved, he represents greatness interrupted. Greatness glimpsed in full speed and then pulled away before football could fully hold on to it. So maybe the final answer is this. Injuries did not just steal years from Ronaldo. They may have stolen a version of football history in which the debate around the greatest ever looks very different. Because the Ronaldo we remember was already legendary, and that may be the most heartbreaking part of all. The legend was real, but the complete career might have been even bigger.